Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes understanding a new word feels super easy, and other times it is like pulling teeth? Well, this new study dives deep into how our brains process compound words, like those made of two parts, and it has got some fascinating insights. So picture this: scientists have found that when we see a word made of two parts, like a teacup, our brain doesn't just see one word, it thinks about each part, tea and cup. But how it processes these parts and how they relate to the whole word's meaning can actually speed things up or slow them down. This research explores this idea in Chinese compound words, which are super common there. And they've uncovered something really cool about how our minds work. You know how words are like building blocks? Well, a compound word is like two blocks stuck together to make a new thing. Scientists have been trying to figure out how our brains put these together. Sometimes the two parts are really obvious, like tea and cup clearly make a cup for tea. Other times it is not so clear. Like, ladybird doesn't really tell you what a ladybird is. They call this semantic transparency, meaning how clear the meaning is from the parts. But here is the puzzle: the results haven't always been the same. Some studies show this transparency helps us understand words faster, some show it slows us down, and some show it doesn't make much difference at all. Why the confusion? These researchers had a hunch. They thought maybe semantic transparency isn't just one thing. Maybe there are different ways our brain looks at the relationship between the parts and the whole word, and these different ways can have different effects. Think of it like a road. Some roads are super highways that get you there fast, and others are winding country lanes that take longer. So how do you test something like that? Well, they looked at Chinese compounds, which are often made of two characters. They used a big data set of Chinese words that people had already looked at in experiments. They created 8 different ways to measure how transparent a word was. They did this by thinking about a few things. First, they considered if the character was the first part or the second part of the compound. Second, they thought about whether the character's meaning was its usual, standalone meaning or a specialized meaning it developed from being in compounds a lot. And third, they looked at the meaning of the whole compound word, whether it was the common dictionary meaning or a meaning you could build from the parts. They used fancy computer models that understand language meaning by looking at how words are used in lots of text. These models help them measure the semantic relatedness, or how similar the meanings were across these different aspects. It is like using a super-powered magnifying glass to see all the subtle connections between the word parts and the whole word. And here's where it gets really interesting. They found 2 main routes, or ways of processing. One route, which they call composition-based transparency, was all about how easily the meanings of the two parts could be combined to make sense. When this was easy, it actually helped people recognize the word faster, meaning it was kind of like a fast lane. But there was another route, called Relatedness-Based Transparency. This looked at how similar the meanings of the parts were to the overall, already known meaning of the whole compound word. When this similarity was high, it actually slowed things down, like a traffic jam. So, what does this mean? It suggests our brains aren't just using one method to understand compound words. When we see a compound, our brain is doing 2 things at once, like having 2 different internal processes running. One process is good at building the meaning from the parts. If the parts fit together nicely to make a sensible new meaning, our brain goes bingo, and we get faster. This is the composition route. The other process is more about matching what we see to what we already know. The established meaning of the whole word. If the parts are too similar to the whole word's meaning, our brain has a harder time distinguishing it from similar words, creating confusion, and that's the relatedness route causing a slowdown. This connects to a bigger idea called lexical superstate. Imagine your brain doesn't just store words as single entries in a dictionary. Instead, when you encounter a word, it activates many related ideas and representations all at once. These multiple representations are there, these superstates, and they can influence how you process the word in different ways. This study provides strong evidence for that. They essentially showed that by looking at these different routes of transparency, they could finally explain why previous studies got such different results. It wasn't that transparency itself was inconsistent, but rather how it was being measured. If a study happened to measure the composition route, they likely saw a speed up. If they measured the relatedness route, they might have seen a slowdown or no effect. By looking at all 8 routes together, they could see this clear split. To get these results, the researchers used some pretty sophisticated math and computer analysis. They crunched the numbers from the lexical decision task, which is basically asking people to quickly decide if a string of letters or characters is a real word or not. They used statistical models to see how different factors, like the transparency scores they calculated, affected how fast people responded and how many errors they made. They even had to deal with some tricky overlaps in their transparency measures by using something called principal component analysis, which is a way to simplify complex data and find the underlying patterns. It sounds complicated. But the main idea is they wanted to isolate the unique effects of each transparency route, and their statistical models worked really well. They found that including these different transparency measures significantly improved their ability to predict how quickly people recognized words. The numbers basically confirmed that these different routes of transparency were really influencing the process. Let's dive into the results a bit more. They found that the composition-based measures, the ones looking at how well the parts fit together, were indeed facilitators. For example, when the meaning of the first character, C1, or the second character, C2, easily combined with the compound's meaning, people responded faster. This means our brain likes to build meaning from the pieces when it fits. But the story didn't stop there. The relatedness-based measures, the ones looking at the overlap between the parts and the whole word's established meaning, consistently led to slower responses and more errors. This is the inhibitory effect. It suggests that if the parts are too similar to the whole word's pre-existing meaning, it creates a kind of confusion or competition in your brain, making it harder to pinpoint the target word. So, the big reveal is this. Semantic transparency isn't a single thing. It is a multidimensional construct. There are at least two main routes our brains use, and they can have opposite effects. One route, building meaning from pieces, speeds things up. The other route, relying on existing word meanings and their overlap with parts, can slow things down. This is a huge step in understanding how we process words. This finally explains why so many previous studies on word transparency got mixed results. Some studies focused on one type of transparency, others on another, and they weren't aware that these different measures were tapping into fundamentally different cognitive processes. It is like trying to measure height, and sometimes you measure someone's shoe size and sometimes their actual height. You are going to get different answers and get confused. The study really shines a light on two distinct ways we process compound words. The first mechanism is all about building a coherent meaning from the constituent parts. If the parts combine easily to form a sensible interpretation, it helps us recognize the word faster. This is especially useful in tasks where we just need to know if it is a word, not necessarily its exact dictionary definition. The second mechanism is more about comparing the constituent parts to the established, stored meaning of the whole word. When there is a lot of overlap, it can create competition. Imagine your brain has multiple very similar options for what the word means, and it has to work harder to pick the right one. This effort to discriminate between similar meanings leads to that slowdown we saw. They've even proposed a model for how this works, a kind of dual route system. One route is for building meaning from the parts, and it is generally helpful. The other route is about matching to existing meanings. And it can be helpful but also cause interference if the similarities are too strong. These routes operate at the same time, but they have opposite effects. This research also lends strong support to another fascinating idea called morphological transcendence. This suggests that the meaning of a word part can actually change depending on the compound it's in. For example, the character for station might have a slightly different nuance when it is part of railway station versus bus station. The study found that these position-dependent meanings, or meanings that change based on where the character is in the compound, do play a role in word recognition, further supporting the idea that our mental lexicon is dynamic and flexible, not static. One interesting little detail they noticed was that the first character C1 of a compound seemed to have a bigger impact than the second character C2, especially in the composition-based route. This might be because we tend to read from left to right, so the first part gives us a head start in building the meaning. Of course, no study is perfect, and the researchers acknowledge this. For instance, they used a task where people just had to decide if something was a word. They suggest that in tasks requiring deeper understanding, like judging if a sentence makes sense, the results might be different. Also, while they inferred that the composition route might be faster, they can't directly measure that with the current study design. So, what is the takeaway here? The way we understand compound words is far more complex than we might have thought. Semantic transparency isn't a single switch, but a spectrum with different pathways that can either help or hinder us. This research really helps us understand the dynamic and flexible nature of our mental lexicon, showing that our brains are constantly juggling multiple ideas and representations to make sense of language. It's a beautiful peek into the complex workings of the human mind. This entire study is a great example of how we can use computational tools and careful experimental design to unravel complex human cognition. It not only solves a puzzle in psycholinguistics, but also makes us think about how we learn and process language every single day. What I love most about this research is how it shows that even seemingly simple tasks like understanding a word involve incredibly complex, multi-layered processes happening in our brains. The idea that different types of relationships between word parts and whole words can have opposite effects is a really powerful insight. It makes me wonder how this applies to other areas of language processing. This research is a significant step forward in understanding how our minds handle the richness and complexity of language, especially in languages like Chinese with its unique word-building structures. It shows us that our mental lexicon is not a static dictionary but a vibrant, dynamic system. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating dives into the world of psychology and neuroscience. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.